I'm Field Marshal Alexandros Papagos of the Hellenic Imperial Legion. This is an account of how Greece came to reform the mighty Byzantine Empire, as well as the Greek perspective of World War II, a conflict that would come to stretch across 6 continents and result in the deaths of millions. In the late 1930s, Greek policies became increasingly anti-Turkish. This was largely due to the influence of His Majesty George II, who had been restored as King of Greece in 1935. George had fought against the Turks in the 1920s, and he still blamed his original loss of the throne on the Greek defeat at their hands. By 1936, the Greek economy had recovered from the Great Depression. We also opposed a Bulgarian request for the removal of the restrictions placed on them after World War I. George united the fractured Greek government with his rhetoric of a restoration of Greek power and prestige through the return of imperial foreign policy, with the ultimate goal of defeating Turkey and the reconquest of the Balkans and Anatolia. On June 14, 1937, the National Assembly pushed through a referendum, which would end up being passed with 92% of Greeks voting for it. The filthy communists would later argue that the lack of a secret ballot compelled voters to support the referendum or else face retribution, but this was a blatant lie by a group who knew their influence was waning. Thus, with the referendum passed, the country was renamed the Byzantine Empire, and George II became emperor. Turkey quickly took action in response, forming the Sadabat Pact with Iran that September, which was clearly a sorry attempt to oppose a Greek return to power. Iraq and Afghanistan would later join the pact a few months later in December. However, the United Kingdom became quite concerned about this alliance and the threat it could pose to their lands in Egypt, and thus they were able to persuade Iraq to lead the pact and join the Allies in April 1938. One of the emperor's first actions was outlawing the Communist Party. Those who weren't arrested quickly fled to neighboring Albania, where communists had seized control of the government 2 months prior. Communist influence continued to spread around the world as the Republicans won the Spanish Civil War and the Soviets defeated a monarchist rebellion in southern Russia. Albania became a base of operations for communists in the Balkans, and they began supporting communist minorities in Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and even in Greece. They had to be stopped, and thus Emperor George took it upon himself to save the Balkans from the vile communists. The Byzantine Empire declared war on Albania on May 5, 1938. General Marcos Drakos was placed in charge of the Imperial Legion. Within about a week, Drakos had surrounded the Albanian border forces, quickly moving to seize the capital of Tirana. The wicked communist government had been defeated, and the Albanian people had been saved. This was not the first major conquest of the late 1930s. Germany had attempted to peacefully annex Austria, but when the Austrian government refused Hitler's invitation, Germany invaded on October 24, 1937. Similar to Albania, Austria would not last long. By January 1939, Emperor George had succeeded in combining church and state and had also greatly restricted Turkish rights throughout our territory. But the war against Turkey would have to wait. In late 1938, we had discovered that Bulgaria was secretly building up their military with the support of Nazi Germany, in direct violation of restrictions placed on them. I began to prepare the Imperial Legion for an invasion, and on February 15, 1939, we declared war on Bulgaria. The fighting in the mountains along the border was rough, but we would find an opening in the Bulgarian defenses in the far eastern part of the border. Our divisions took Plovdiv, and from there we split the country in half. I ordered General Drakos to focus on the western front first in order to seize the Bulgarian capital of Sofia. The fighting was tough and was made even more challenging due to the fact that we essentially had no air force, allowing the Bulgarians to dominate the skies. Thankfully, poor weather kept their air force grounded for much of the war. However, the rain would cause our troops issues as well, as the mud delayed Drakos' march towards Sofia. But our divisions eventually entered Sofia on April 6. While part of our army continued to fight against the division still located around the capital, the rest of our forces shifted focus to the eastern front. We eventually cut off a large portion of the Bulgarian army from their base of supply in Varna. This forced their surrender and ended any hope for the Bulgarians. They capitulated on May 11, 1939, and were thus annexed into the Byzantine Empire. World War II, the conflict that would stretch across the world and affect nearly every country on Earth, began on June 14, 1939, when the Soviet Union declared war on the Polish-Romanian alliance. The Poles fought hard, putting up a stiff resistance against the Soviets and making them fight for every mile of land they took. However, after 5 long months of fighting, the Soviets had bottled up the Polish army into the far north of the country. The Red Army entered Warsaw, bloody street fighting ensued, and on November 20th, the Soviets had taken the capital, forcing Poland to surrender. The Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland and created the puppet state of the Polish People's Republic to govern the rest of the country. Romania turned out to be even more of a challenging campaign for the Soviet Union. They pushed deep into Romanian territory and even control all of Romania's coastline along the Black Sea. But the situation had fallen into a stalemate as the Soviets found themselves unable to push any closer to Bucharest. They had hoped to break the stalemate with divisions soon to arrive from the Polish front. However, on November 23rd, 3 days after the surrender of Poland, Romania joined the Axis powers. The Germans and Italians professed they stood against Soviet aggression and honored their new alliance with Romania with a joint declaration of war on the Soviet Union. On January 10, 1940, Hungary joined the Axis as well, creating a unified front against the Soviets from the Black Sea to the Baltic. The Soviets met initial success, taking over much of East Prussia and invading into Germany proper, but through the months of January and February, Germany launched an offensive that began pushing the Soviets back into Poland. By mid-March, Germany had taken Warsaw, forcing the capitulation of the Polish People's Republic. Romania had also met much success, taking back the majority of their territory and cutting off a large Soviet army in the port of Constanta. The tide turned against the Axis when Hitler declared war on Czechoslovakia on March 24, 1940. Both the Allies, led by Britain and France, and the Nordic Brotherhood, an alliance between Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland, were guaranteeing the independence of Czechoslovakia. However, Hitler believed that both factions had no interest in war with the Axis, thus gambled that they would not honor their guarantees. He gravely miscalculated. Perhaps the Allies and Brotherhood were emboldened by the fact that Germany was distracted with their war against the USSR. Regardless, they honored their guarantees, and both the Allies and the Nordic Brotherhood declared war on the Axis powers. Within 2 weeks, the Allies had neutralized the Siegfried Line and began pushing into Western Germany, taking control of Munich on April 12th. Hitler had been so sure that the Allies were bluffing that he had kept the majority of his divisions on the Eastern Front. When the Allies declared war, there simply wasn't enough time for Germany to shift divisions to the west. By June 1940, the Axis were collapsing as French and British divisions invaded Germany and Italy from the west, and the Nordic Brotherhood invaded Germany from the north. With the Allies now involved in a major conflict, our great leader, Emperor George, took upon himself the righteous task of protecting the Balkans from fascist and communist influence. After our courteous offer of protection was rejected by the Yugoslavian king, the Byzantine Empire declared war on Yugoslavia on April 13th. Due to his admirable command in the Bulgarian War, I placed General Dracos in charge of the majority of the Imperial Legion, with 24 divisions under his command. His task was to push the line forward while a third of his army attacked from Sofia towards Belgrade. General Katsimitros was given 10 divisions with orders to attack east from Albania, with the goal of cutting off the Yugoslavian army from the capital. The Yugoslavians had to maintain a portion of their army along the Italian and German borders to protect against a surprise attack by the Axis. Thus, they didn't even have enough divisions to defend their entire southern border. Dracos met initial success pushing towards Belgrade, but after 2 weeks of advancing, his divisions were stopped cold before they reached the Great Morava River. Katsimitros had a much tougher time getting past the strong defensive position the Yugoslavians had in the mountains of Serbia. It wasn't until early May that he finally broke through. By the end of the month, his army had pushed from Albania to Bulgaria, cutting off 9 Yugoslavian divisions. Dracos' divisions closed in from all sides, forcing the 9 divisions to surrender in early June. With a third of their southern army destroyed, Yugoslavia had little chance of stopping our advance north. They put up a valiant defense through June, but Dracos cut the front in two, pushing behind the Yugoslavians and taking Sarajevo on July 18th. His forces took the capital of Belgrade the following day. Despite losing their capital, the Yugoslavians continued to fight on. They retook Sarajevo in a brief moment of victory, but their army was split into 3, allowing Dracos to conquer the north of the country with very little resistance. On August 21st, 1940, Yugoslavia finally capitulated. They suffered 212,000 casualties in the war, while we lost 109,000 men. Our war with Yugoslavia ended only 10 days after Germany surrendered on August 11th. They had held strong on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, but couldn't stop the Allies from taking Frankfurt and the Brotherhood from taking most of their northern coastline. Both factions closed in on Berlin, which was eventually taken by Swedish forces. But despite the capitulation of the German government, much of the German army refused to surrender, instead retreating to northern Italy. There, the Germans and Italians built up a massive defensive network in the already highly defensible mountainous region. The Allies were unable to push into Lombardy, Romagna, or Veneto. The Hungarians and Romanians also continued to put up a staunch defense in spite of the fact that they were defending against both the Allies, who were attacking from Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union. By September, the war was in a complete stalemate. To make matters worse for the Allies, Republican Spain joined the Comintern on September 3rd. The Russians hoped to use Spain as a base to launch invasions into Sicily and southern Italy. The French and British feared a Comintern takeover of Italy, allowing them to control the Mediterranean. In a move of desperation, the Allies signed a secret treaty with the Byzantine Empire. They agreed to recognize the legitimate Byzantine ownership of the Balkans in exchange for us joining the war against Italy. On September 7, 1940, we honored our agreement and declared war on the Axis powers. Dracos split his army into 2. The majority of his divisions were placed along the Hungarian border, while a small detachment was sent to Zara to quickly defeat the Italian divisions defending there. The Hungarians were completely surprised with our entrance into the war, and thus Dracos met hardly any resistance as his divisions marched towards Budapest. He took the Hungarian capital on September 15th, forcing Hungary's surrender the following day. General Katsimitros was assigned to the Italian front. The Italians made an effective stand at Venice in the preliminary stages of the war, but our army ultimately defeated them, taking Venice on September 19th. From there, our divisions began to push south. The Italians fought hard at every river, hill, and city, ensuring our army's progress was slow. We took Bologna on September 30th and Florence on October 8th. From Florence, Katsimitros pushed to Livorno, cutting off the Italians and Germans defending against the French in the north. As our armies advanced south, the Italians prepared for their final defense in Rome. Taking the city had taken so long that Katsimitros had conquered most of southern Italy by the time Rome fell. With the loss of their capital, Italy surrendered on November 1st, 1940. The Italian surrender brought an end of much of the fighting in Europe, though the war continued against Japan in Asia. In the subsequent peace treaty, Germany, Poland, Romania, Luxembourg, and Somalia were made puppets of the Soviet Union. Italy and Hungary transitioned to democratic republics and joined the Allies against Japan. Austria, Libya, and Eritrea became neutral independent countries, though fascist governments still ruled in Austria and Eritrea. The Byzantine Empire received Istria, Zara, and Dodecanese from Italy due to our vital assistance in the war. Canada had suffered devastating casualties in the war, particularly in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese. In the 1940 election, the world was shocked when the Canadian people elected a far-right fascist government who promised peace and complete independence from Britain. The United States, which had remained neutral under President Wendell Willkie, threatened war. Britain pleaded with the United States to allow them to handle the matter, but the US was pushed to action when the new Canadian PM began military training actions along the US-Canada border. By late November, the US and Canada were at war. The Allies came to the defense of Canada, and the Soviets declared war on the United States shortly after as well. In December, Japan convinced Mexico to join their faction, promising that the US was doomed and that Mexico would receive control of Western America if they allowed Japanese troops to invade from Mexican territory. World War II had now spread to the Americas. The United States quickly crossed the Canadian border, defeating their northern neighbor on January 14, 1941, before the Allies had been able to send assistance. The fight against Mexico proved more difficult due to the Japanese, but by the spring they had been defeated by the US as well. Meanwhile, in Asia, the Chinese had pushed Japan out of their country, leading the Soviets to launch an invasion of Japanese-held Korea. By early February, the Soviets were in control of Korea, taking the last Japanese province in mainland Asia. Japan made peace with China, but remained at war with the Allies, Comintern, and the US. With the world distracted, the emperor found it to be the perfect time to finally gain back the ancient city of Constantinople. On March 6, he sent an ultimatum to Turkey, demanding that they give up Istanbul or face war. The Turks agreed to the demands, and the Byzantines took possession of the city and the surrounding area. Emperor George renamed the city to Constantinople and made it the Byzantine capital. Finally, the Ottoman conquest of the city in 1453 had been revenged. This display of Turkish weakness would eventually lead to the collapse of the Sadabat Pact. Iran faced a communist takeover of the government in April, resulting in them joining the Comintern. Afghanistan would remain in the pact for another year before abandoning the alliance with Turkey in early 1942. Back in North America, the United States conquered Greenland in July 1941. The rest of the war would take place in the seas, as each of the three factions attempted to gain naval superiority. The United States Navy initially focused on the Pacific, destroying what was left of the Japanese fleet. They then shifted gears to the Atlantic. From August 41 to January 42, the Americans engaged in several massive naval battles with the British, French, and Soviet fleets. In the end, the US had succeeded at defeating the majority of the navies of all of their enemies, leaving the war in a long stalemate. When Afghanistan left the Sadabat Pact, leading to its collapse, and the world still embroiled in conflict, it became clear that now was the best opportunity for our final revenge against the Turks. On March 1, 1942, the Byzantine Empire declared war on Turkey. General Dracos attacked the main Turkish army from Constantinople, while Katsimitros landed on the western shores of Anatolia with his army. Dracos confronted heavy resistance and was unable to advance. However, Katsimitros and our western army had considerable success on the southwestern front, taking the port of Antalya in a little over a week of fighting. From there, our light tanks pushed deep into enemy territory, occupying Konya and the Turkish capital of Ankara with very little resistance. The main Turkish army, shocked by the rapid advance of Katsimitros' army, scrambled to pull back and retake Ankara. They successfully cut off our tank division in the capital from the rest of our army. The division found themselves surrounded and fighting for their lives. Katsimitros' line was extremely overstretched, thus we ordered another light tank division to attack north, taking Bursa and cutting off the Turkish divisions defending Izmir. This distracted the Turkish army from their attack on Ankara, allowing Katsimitros to relieve the stranded tank division there, who had successfully defended the city for over a week with a shortage of supplies. After taking Izmir and forcing the surrender of the 6 defending divisions, our armies were able to concentrate on pushing further east. Dracos had still found no success in his attempts to break through the mountain defenses arrayed against him, but he was distracting 4 Turkish divisions. It wasn't until early April that Dracos' army finally achieved victory, allowing them to press south towards Katsimitros' army, as well as advance east along the northern Black Sea coast. With the majority of the Turkish forces trapped between our two armies, we were able to quickly force their surrender, allowing our armies to push east and conquer the rest of the country with very little resistance. Turkey submitted their unconditional surrender on May 2nd and were annexed into the Byzantine Empire. Finally, the emperor controlled Anatolia again and had achieved an ultimate revenge against the Turks. In June 1942, the Federative Republic of Brazil created the Mercosul faction, which was an alliance of American countries against European and Japanese aggression. Brazil, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Peru, Cuba, and Haiti were the initial members of the alliance. After a faction-wide meeting in Brasilia, the Mercosur countries agreed to invite the US to the faction and to assist them in their conflict. World War II continued for another 2 months. The Mercosur faction was vastly outnumbered, thus couldn't win the war with an invasion of Europe or Asia. Japan had been defeated on the mainland and had little chance of doing anything other than defending their homeland. And both the Allies and Comintern had lost most of their navies against the US, hence had no ability to invade Japan or the Americas. Thus, all 5 factions agreed to a ceasefire and a peace conference to end the war. After weeks of negotiations, a settlement was agreed to. The mainland Japanese territories would become the Soviet puppets of Manchu, Mongolia, and Xinjiang. The United States annexed Canada, Greenland, and Mexico. The US also promised financial compensation to Britain and France for their losses in the war. Thus, on August 17, 1942, World War II finally ended after over 3 years of fighting. The Allies had taken the highest losses with 3.08 million casualties. 1.35 million of those were British citizens. Japan's faction suffered 644,000 casualties, the Comintern 566,000, the Nordic Brotherhood 196,000, and the Mercosur faction only 65,000 casualties, most of which were Americans. Peace in the world would not last long. On August 29th, just 12 days after the peace treaty, the Chinese Civil War broke out. It is likely that Communist China had been encouraged by the Soviet Union to attack the Republic of China, as we discovered evidence that the USSR began sending weapons to the Communists shortly after the start of the war. The Communists advanced rapidly, and by February 1943, they conquered most of China and Tibet. The Republican government had collapsed, and a warlord from Yunnan took over what was left of southern China and became the main defender against further communist expansion. 1943 proved an eventful year in Europe as well. Italy abandoned the Allies after participating in a secret meeting with Emperor George. The Byzantine Empire and Italy officially formed a new faction called the Holy Alliance in February. Fascist Austria would join the alliance soon after, and Hungary and Afghanistan became members of the faction in May and June. And this is where our story ends for now. It's June 1943, and 6 different factional alliances stretch across the world, sitting in an awkward peace. Conflict between the factions is inevitable. The question is, who will break the peace, and which faction will emerge victorious from the ashes of the Third World War?